And this is Wisdom Teachings. Did Russian scientists discover in 1997 that our entire solar system is undergoing an unprecedented, massive, energetic transformation? Were they the first to officially release this information to the world? Is it possible that NASA data from the West can be applied to this problem and draw the same conclusions? And what occurs when you do this and are the first in the Western world to make those publications, only to discover that in the fast and loose early days of the internet, you might just have everything taken from you? That's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode of Wisdom Teachings. We've seen unbelievable evidence that there is, in fact, a widespread continuity in these prophecies across so many different cultural contexts. And remember, I haven't even given you all of them. We have Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend, who in their epic work, Hamlet's Mill, that I first learned about from Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, there's 35 different ancient spiritual traditions that all talk about this 25,000-year cycle of the precession and very consistently describe some sort of golden age that occurs, and in many of the cases, if not almost all of them, there is some suggestion of solar changes as well. So this is a very widespread prophetic tradition, and if I wanted to do more homework and get into Hamlet's Mill and break them down one by one, we could do even more of those episodes. The point is, when you do your homework, you find out everybody is expecting, at least in the ancient world, that there's going to be some massive change in our solar system. I was addressing this problem for a long time, thinking some measurable change in the physics of our solar system to correspond to a solar event of that magnitude. This is not something that occurs when the sun is just hanging out, doing its normal everyday routine, and not changing very much. This is something that would occur if there is a massive discontinuity, and there would need to be an energetic charge up. There would need to be something really obvious, in your face, blatant, undeniable. And I didn't find out what that in your face change was until the year 2000. As I said in previous episodes, when Mark Cummings, the physicist, brought me the information of Dr. Oleksiy Dmitriev. And this was when I first got exposed to the idea of interplanetary climate change, which is NASA's hottest secret. Oh man, come on. Yeah, I went there. So Dr. Oleksiy Dmitriev is the scientist who built his whole model of this transformation off of what he called natural self-luminous formations. And this is a little bit of a review for you, but it is important to remember that the NSLF, or vacuum domain, there's different names for it, is a bubble in space-time in which gravitational energy is transforming into electromagnetic energy through some natural process. Gravitation, of course, is invisible, but electromagnetic energy emerges as photons, which are visible light. Therefore, what we're actually seeing is a plasma ball, which in many cases is visible, or at least is very, very slightly visible if you can look at it perhaps with infrared. And we did a lot of stuff on that already, but it's important to understand perhaps with infrared. And we did a lot of stuff on that already, but it's important to understand that in Dmitriev's model, the sun is putting out countless millions of these all the time. And as we go into this new energetic domain that he was talking about, we're going to have more of them come out of the sun. And he said that these plasma balls are actually transforming matter, energy, and consciousness as they zoom in. So they are hitting us, they're hitting our bodies, they're hitting the earth, they're hitting the matter around us, and they're actually changing the very nature of reality. That potentially could even lead to a dimensional shift. And so, because I never actually finished his slides before, and then we went into the prophecy section, I want to just review his conclusions now because they're so relevant to what we're talking about here. And remember, I read this in December 2000. It has become vitally important that a world chart be prepared, setting forth the favorable and the catastrophic regions on Earth, taking into account the quality of their geological and geophysical environment, the variety and intensity of their cosmic influences, and here's the key, the real level of spiritual and ethical development of the people occupying those areas. Well, this was stunning to me because the Law of One material had already made a very compelling case linking the ethical and spiritual development of people in a given area to the climate. And this is also something we see, for example, in ancient Asian lineage teachings, that the strength of the leader and the ethical quality of the leader and the people is then a reflection of the climate. And so they blame bad weather on their own collective. And there's a lot of really interesting Russian science we've already looked at regarding pyramids, showing that in fact when you build these pyramids, you're reducing severe weather, you're reducing the threat of earthquakes, you're reducing the threat of volcanoes, you're adding water vapor to the air, you're increasing the oxygen content, you're purifying water underground. All these amazing things are happening, suggesting the pyramid in some way is able to harness and enhance this natural consciousness energy that's coming in with these plasma balls and activating our DNA. Hundreds of thousands of these natural self-luminous formations are exerting an increasing influence upon Earth's geophysical fields and biosphere. We suggest that the presence of these formations is the mainstream precedent to the transformation of Earth. An Earth which becomes more and more subject to the transitional physical processes which exist within the borderland between the physical vacuum, or ether, whatever you want to call it, and our material world. Now, this, of course, is where, at that very fertile time in my life, when I was still, I believe, in my 20s, or late 20s, early 30s, thereabouts, that's when I discovered the work of Dr. William Tift, this very strange thing we've talked about, that redshift is quantized. And redshift is not a function of distance, as we said. It's simply a microwave frequency given off by stars that astrophysicists assume is distance. But really, the microwave frequency is telling us something else. Dr. Harold Aston's physics calculated that those microwave frequencies represent planes of existence. And he had it theoretically calculated with the math down to multiple decimal points of accuracy of what Dr. wave frequency. And those frequencies literally correspond to planes of existence. Now here's the key. Because it is quantized, as I've been saying, a sun must go through a quantum shift from one frequency to the next with nothing in between. And it's very obvious that that would involve a spontaneous energetic release at the moment that the quantized shift occurs. In other words, we are not talking about anything gradual here. The physics itself mandates that this is a spontaneous shift. Now that was not Russian science. That was me looking at a bunch of very gifted people and how their contributions fit together. Dr. Dmitriev, Dr. Aston, Dr. Tift, combining those elements and finding a greater whole and seeing that there is a unified scientific model. The problem is you could discover the holy grail of physics, but it's not just like you automatically get credit for it. In fact, exactly the opposite could occur. So let's talk about how this all came crashing down on my head. I did a casual interview in 2001 about the connection between myself and Edgar Cayce that ultimately led to the production of this book with my co-author Win Free. Obviously, it's called The Reincarnation of Edgar Cayce. So before that book ever came out in 2005 is actually when it finally was released, we were already working very hard to get this thing going. And it actually started with him just interviewing me for a radio show and for a magazine article that came out in 2001. And he interviewed me, I believe, in April or May of 2001. It didn't even emerge until later. So in that interview, I wasn't even in a good mood. I was until later. So in that interview, I wasn't even in a good mood. I was cranky. I didn't have enough sleep. And I went through the whole Edgar Cayce connection, not knowing that he was eventually going to get a book deal for this, and that 4 or 5 years later it was going to become a book. At the time, I was just talking about it as any other interview. And I also went through the interplanetary climate change data. And he submitted it to this publication, Spirit of Mott, which was run by Drunvalo Melchizedek. And they did not want the Cayce material, and they said, look, you really ought to make this into a book. And that was ultimately what led to that happening. So what we did then is he wrote an article that just focused on the interplanetary climate change data, and then that came out just before 9/11. And this is where it gets really sad because it was stolen. The actual article was published on about, I believe, September 8th, 2001. It was that close. And then September 11th happens, this mass catastrophic trauma affecting everyone. And the next thing you know, someone takes that article and strips out, first of all, at least over 20 references I'd put in, where you got the number and then it goes to a footnote at the end, and you can click on those links and read the science. Those were taken out. All of the stuff about me was taken out, and it was turned into Russian scientists. But as I just said, combining Tift, Afton, and Dmitriev is not Russian. That was something I did. But they reframed this whole thing, stripped me out of it, shortened it dramatically, and that turned into an internet email chain letter. And I have to assume at least 50 million people saw this based on just the sheer number of websites that was so depressing, because nothing I'd ever done before had gone that viral. I'd never had millions of people read something I did. And then even worse, all of these different pseudo-channelers started to put their name on the heading. One of them I actually even threatened with a lawsuit for doing this, and they claimed that they wrote it. So there were so many iterations of this thing going out there. It was unbelievable. There were literally millions of views, and no one knew who wrote it. And just to show you this, even right now, I just did this morning, I type in the two keywords Dmitriev and natrium, which was my poor scholarship at the time, not realizing natrium, or Na, is just a mistranslation of sodium. You can still see that even the first hit on the internet is not me. That's the second one, Divine Cosmos is me, but the first one is one of these stolen copies, Russian View of Planetary Changes. It wasn't Russian, it was me. And so 3,500 different copies of this stolen article still existing online. And everybody started to use this data to promote a false hypothesis, which is that Planet X is responsible, that there's this big planet that's coming in, and that's what's causing everything to heat up. What did I just tell you, though? It's these spherical walls that are expanding away from the center of a galaxy that cause quantum changes in the sun, and it's that level of magnificent power that's causing this. A tiny little planet is not going to do that. The sun has 99.86% of all the mass in the solar system, so all the other planets combined only accounts for 0.14%. So do you think one planet is going to do anything? No, I'm sorry. The Planet X model is wrong. So I had 3 years to meditate on this terrible failure, of having my work be stolen without credit, and then that becomes what gets to be so famous. And again, please don't interpret this as just me having an ego. I had already written an entire scientific book called The Shift of the Ages about this data, and if people hadn't have stolen my identity, then the readers would have been able to read an entire book, giving them more information about why this is happening. So I approached the top guy in the field. The timing of this was very fortuitous because Art Bell and Whitley Strieber had written this classic book, The Coming Global Superstorm, and it was now being turned into a film. So this was great for the Art Bell audience. So here's the book. As you can see, Art Bell, Whitley Strieber, and their model is that there was going to be some sort of massive climate change in the northern hemisphere due to a collapse in the thermal cycling of the Atlantic Ocean, that they believed we were going to go through a massive cold spell, that it was going to suddenly get very, very cold. This then turns into the movie Day After Tomorrow, really with almost no credit to Art Bell or Whitley Strieber at all, except for something at the very end of the credits. But here you see what looks like New York, Manhattan, covered in snow from this thermal collapse. So this was fear porn at its finest. You have massive tornadoes, massive earth changes in the movie, a total disaster affecting the entire planet. Here's the Statue of Liberty being tsunamied, and very depressing things. And this is, of course, harnessing the power of our visualization. And part of this is, again, the cabal trying to authorize these disasters, which they want, by showing them to us and hoping that our creative power will bring that into visualization. Well, here's the infamous New York Library with this massive amount of snow that had come into it. So what we wanted to do was to spread the word about Dmitriev's paper and time the release of this data with this film, since we can piggyback on that multi-million-dollar marketing campaign and the power of Coast to Coast, reaching all these millions of people, and say to people, hey, not only was Art right in Global Superstorm, but now there's a lot more data besides just what you see in the movie, what you saw in the book. It's the whole solar system showing us something big is going on. But Richard had a very key point that was difficult for me. He said, all you've got, David, from Dmitriev is Russian science. We've seen these skeptics and these haters. They're not going to accept that. They're going to just say that it's bunk. The Russians, oh, we don't believe them. Where is the NASA data? And my answer was, well, I'm sure it must be there. So this led to me going through 4 months of very, very intensive research, and it ultimately created over 130 academic references, which is sufficient for a doctoral dissertation. You only need 120. And this is where we finally published Interplanetary Day After Tomorrow, an Enterprise Mission Hyperdimensional Report. I wrote almost the whole thing, but Richard put his name first, and I did get pretty grumpy about that at the time. But you can see there, it was dated 2004. So yes, this was not 2005. I misspoke. This was 2004, where all this came out. So what I did is I went through and covered some of the highlights in this paper, and this is what we're going to do a whole bunch of episodes on now. I'm just going to start by giving you the bullet points. If we look at the sun, we see that there's more solar activity since 1940 than the previous 1,150 years combined. And that's only Ilya Usoskin's data. You're going to see there's a lot more than that. On Mercury, we're finding weird ice at the poles, along with a surprisingly strong intrinsic magnetic field for a planet that is supposed to be dead with no magnetic field at all. Then we see on Venus, among many things, a 2,500% increase in the brightness of its glow and a substantial global atmospheric change in less than 30 years. We'll get into all that stuff coming up. Earth has had substantial, obvious worldwide weather and geophysical changes. Mars has had a global warming with huge storms, the disappearance of its polar ice caps, and much, much more. Jupiter has had over a 200% increase in the brightness of plasma that surrounds the planet. All of this, again, is caused by the interplanetary climate change. Saturn has had a major decrease in the speed of its jet stream in only 20 years around the equator, along with X-rays surging from this same area. Uranus has had really big changes, that's a quote from a NASA scientist, in its overall brightness, and has many more clouds than it had before that are very bright. Neptune has had a 40% increase in the brightness of its atmosphere. Pluto has had a 300% increase in its atmospheric pressure, even as it's drifting away from the sun. And none of these statistics are fringe. They're all coming directly out of NASA itself. And they are all very, very real. What you have just read is only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. So eventually, all of this data that I had put together was compiled and shortened and put into my first major book that I released on my own with a publisher, the Source Field Investigations, in 2011. I was greatly honored that it became a New York Times bestseller, and you can see what the original cover looked like right here with the subtle indication of a sacred geometry inside that sphere. That would be the octahedron. We didn't know what was going to happen with the 2012 prophecies, but notice here on the top right, we have Graham Hancock himself saying that the book is magnificent. So that was a real big honor that he did that. So in 2009 December, NASA finally admitted that we were heading into a highly magnetized and very hot cloud. This had never come out before, and I did cover this in previous episodes, but we're going to review this before I show you some new stuff. This was the original NASA publication, the interstellar discovery, that our sun is moving into something they're calling the very unimpressive term local fluff. And the quote said, "The solar system is passing through an interstellar cloud that physics says should not exist. It's much too magnetic and it's much too hot." So they were coming out with this in 2009 already, and it's only grown since then. So here's the little quote up close where it says, you can read it just like I told you, physics says this cloud should not exist. And then she's saying we found this cloud just outside the solar system. This is Dr. Merav Ofer. Here's her paper in Nature, a strong, highly tilted interstellar magnetic field near the solar system. And then when you actually double-click and read it, this is where the paper was done. Now here's some new stuff for you. In October 2015, NASA announced that the gas that we're moving into in this local cloud is even hotter than we thought. It has a huge temperature, which it's supposed to be cold in space. And now we're moving into this thing that's got really, really hot gas. If you remember, Dr. Merav Ofer had calculated to be at 6,000 degrees Celsius, and 100 degrees Celsius will boil water. So wait a minute, we're not dealing with some area of the galaxy that's really cold. We're getting heated up. If you move into a hotter room than the one you're already in, what do you think is going to happen to your body temperature? It's going to go up. So if the sun is moving into a hotter room, a hotter cloud, then what's going to happen to the sun and the planets? They're going to get hotter. It's very, very obvious, but they don't ever make that connection. Let's take a look. So what we're seeing here is the International Boundary Explorer, or IBEX, and this is the satellite probe that's out there studying the far reaches of the boundary of our solar system. I'm not going to read it off of this. I'm going to break out a couple bullet points here so you can see this for yourself. So here's the quote. 8 papers highlight the interstellar helium measurements taken by IBEX and the Joint European Space Agency and NASA Ulysses spacecraft, which launched in 1990. And this is important because 1990 was the only previous time they got this measurement. These are the only 2 spacecraft to have directly measured the local interstellar flow of these helium atoms. And here's the key. Both data sets now affirm that the local interstellar flow is significantly hotter than believed previously based on the Ulysses observations alone, and provide insight into the direction the heliosphere is moving through the local material in the galaxy, as well as how fast it is traveling. So the key here is that Ulysses in 1990 was only seeing this lower temperature, but then when they have IBEX look at it circa 2011, 2012, and thereafter, it becomes much, much hotter. Well, that's a massive temperature increase. And they're not calling it that, but as you saw in that quote, they're saying it's significantly hotter than they believed it was even possible to be. And they continue to release data about this. Here's one from May 2012, where it says that the local interstellar medium has far more magnetic energy in it than they expected. IBEX reveals a missing boundary at the edge of the solar system. That's the title of the article. Now what they're doing is they're describing how they have modified their view of the heliosphere based on this new information, and it doesn't look the same. It's now being bent and warped by this awesome force of the interstellar flow, as you see there on the right, that's pushing against it. They now say there is no bow shock, it's only a bow wave, so they've had to radically modify that, and we'll get into that a little later. Scientists believe this asymmetry, meaning that bent shape that you just saw of the heliosphere, is caused by the force and direction of magnetic fields ramming into the heliosphere from outside, the same way a hand pushing on a balloon will force it out of shape. Now, maybe the heliosphere wasn't getting rammed so much before. Maybe because it's so much more force and density that now the heliosphere is being changed. And so they didn't think about it changing shape. They're just saying, well, this is what it looks like now, and it's very different than what we expected it to be. This was the first clue that there's a strong magnetic field exerting pressure on the outskirts of the solar system, which they did not think before, but now they realize it has to be, based on that funny shape. Independently, IBEX has seen a well-defined band or ribbon at the edge of the heliosphere, believed to be defined by this external magnetic field. Other studies from IBEX have helped quantify the magnitude of the magnetic field, showing that it is on the strong end of what was previously thought even possible. So there's way too much heat, there's way too much magnetic energy. This is the underlying theme that we're seeing. We've seen one after another signature of a very strong magnetic field in the galactic environment, says Nathan Schwadron, a space scientist at the University of New Hampshire in Durham who had worked on this study. That magnetic field influences the structure of the heliosphere and the boundaries themselves. That leads to a whole new paradigm. Well, that's a very significant statement. They did not expect they were going to see this magnetic energy. Dr. Maravofer originally discovered it in 2009. Now, by 2012, they're saying we need a whole new paradigm. There's way too much stuff out there. There's way too much magnetic energy. There's way too much heat. Where the heck is it coming from? We don't know, so we have to change the paradigm. And the new paradigm is we're moving into something that's really hot, and that's going to heat up the whole solar system. So this was the way that they used to see the heliosphere. I've showed you these before. The termination shock, now they're saying that doesn't even exist. It's all been modified. The bow shock, as you see there, they're saying, nope, now there's no bow shock. It's all gone. And instead, again, here's what they used to think it looks like, this teardrop-shaped heliosphere. And everybody thought that's the way it was. And maybe it did look like that before. And you can see so many NASA diagrams. But now, just since all this stuff has happened, now this is what they're saying it looks like. Now notice that one of the weirdest things about this is that the heliosphere itself, the solar magnetic field, is much more spherical than they thought. You can actually very clearly see there is a sphere inside, and it's very round, and then at the top and the bottom you have what look like chimneys of smoke coming off of it, and that is the rest of the magnetic field. And Corey Goode's Blue Avians told us that they put a sphere of energy around the solar system in 2012. And these measurements were published in 2012. So that is a very interesting connection that one of my readers pointed out to me. And here's another image of it rendered out in 3D, where it actually looks more like a fortune cookie now, but you can still very clearly see the spherical area in the middle. So this is some very interesting stuff here that brings us to our next episode, where we're going to be describing how the sun has changed. And you will be amazed when you see the scope and the depth and the profundity of the data that brings that point into existence. Remember, the Holy Grail that we're seeking here is scientific proof of a cosmic energetic shift, that we're moving into this new energy zone, as I just showed you, that the sun is charging up, the planets are transforming, and the net ultimate effect is a solar flash leading to spontaneous ascension. I'm David Wilcock. This is Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information that you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.